The president tried his best to negotiate with the Democrat leaders. They effectively gave him the middle finger.
Donald Trump is trying to make this shutdown as cruel as possible.
This is Today As It Happened. Good Tuesday evening to you. I'm Holly Furfer here with your chronological look at the biggest events and stories of the day. From a federal court hearing on the use of tear gas by ICE agents to the continuing fallout of the federal government shutdown. But first, let's take a look at some of our other headlines that top the news today. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. military conducted 3 strikes Monday in the Eastern Pacific against boats suspected of carrying drugs. Those strikes killed 14 people and left 1 survivor. The U.S. military began these strikes in early September, and they were initially spaced weeks apart. But this is the first time multiple strikes have been announced in a single day, showing the administration's intensified approach to combating drug trafficking. Amazon cutting about 14,000 corporate jobs as the tech giant ramps up spending on artificial intelligence. Affected workers will be notified today and given 90 days to find new internal roles. The cuts represent about 4% of Amazon's corporate workforce and are the biggest since 2023, when the company eliminated 27,000 positions. Amazon says the move is necessary to compete with OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and other AI leaders.
And the controllers, they've sent a message: open up the government, end the shutdown, figure out how you guys can negotiate, have a conversation, but pay us in the interim. Make sure we get paid for the work that we provide to the American people. I'll just note that in the Senate, a bill came up that said, okay, let the shutdown continue, but there's critical staff, critical workforce that come into work every single day, like air traffic controllers. Those workers who are coming to work, let's have a bill that pays them for the work they do. And Democrats said no to that.
Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy discussed the situation with the government shutdown and its impacts on air travel and air traffic controllers. So let's bring in Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed live on Capitol Hill. And Nate, you were listening to that press conference too. Sounds like we are being braced to expect delays when it comes to air travel. And he talked about, I guess, a lot about how it's going to affect the future of air traffic controllers. What did you make from what he said?
Yeah, look, Republicans really seem to think that they have the upper hand here in the messaging as this shutdown stretches even longer. And look, what we heard from Secretary Duffy in just the last couple of moments, it echoes pretty closely what we're hearing from Republican congressional leadership here on Capitol Hill. Just the fact that the longer this shutdown lasts, the more painful it will become. Democrats remain dogged on their fight for these Affordable Care Act subsidies, which expire at the end of this year. If they don't extend them, they say that millions of Americans will lose their health insurance or be forced to face much higher costs to get health insurance through their state's exchanges or marketplaces, effectively making Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, a whole lot more expensive for so many millions of American families. But ultimately, what Secretary Duffy's comments were this morning alongside the head of an air traffic controllers union sound pretty similar to what Republicans have been saying up here on Capitol Hill. Here's House Speaker Mike Johnson and the House Majority Leader Steve Scalise.
What are these Democrats waiting for? This is not a game. This is not leverage. They're taking food off the table for families, for babies. It's disgusting. It's time to end the madness.
There's nothing that the White House has run out of it. They have all the pain dials turned back to just a 0 or a 1 as best they can. But when you're out of resources, they go all the way up. And it's out of their hands. It's out of our hands. And that's why we're so frustrated. You don't see the happy warrior Steve Scalise pound the podium very often. But we're angry about this.
And AFGE, the largest union of government employees, announcing yesterday that they support a clean CR, a short-term bill to reopen the government funded at the current funding levels. That's pretty much exactly what the Republican approach has been up to this point. And so not necessarily backing one party or the other, but at the same time aligning themselves with the Republican position of passing that short-term funding bill. Now Democrats, forced to defend their position in light of the union's announcement that they support this bill. Again, a lot of questions about whether the shutdown continues, especially with the news we've got about SNAP, another crucial government program the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, running out in over 24 states come November 1st. Again, the longer this shutdown lasts, the more painful it appears to be becoming. And the Trump administration trying to highlight that at every step with, a lot of these cabinet secretaries getting out there and trying to spread that message. Just most recently, Secretary Duffy with their head of the Air Traffic Controllers Union.
All right, Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed live for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you for that update.
Thanks, Holly.
And in other news, President Trump is in Japan. He met with the country's newly elected Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. She becomes Japan's first female prime minister just days ago, and now must build a relationship with President Trump while defending her country's economic interests. The House Oversight Committee wants Attorney General Pam Bondi to investigate presidential pardons the Biden White House issued using AutoPen. The Republican-led committee sent a 93-page report alleging a cover-up of the former president's cognitive decline. They claim President Biden did not make all the clemency decisions on his own, that he had publicly disputed claims, calling them lies. During his time in office, Biden issued more than 4,200 pardons and commutations, the most of any previous president. This is Today As It Happened. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Today As It Happened. All right, let's check back in on our daily briefing of today's top stories.
We're now in day 28 of the government shutdown. More and more Americans are feeling the pain, and that includes federal workers, members of the military about to miss their first paychecks ever during the shutdown. Thousands of federal workers have already gone without pay for weeks. As a result, many of them are now turning to food banks to feed their families. Scripps News national correspondent Stephanie Liebergen is live at a food bank for federal workers here in the nation's capital. Stephanie, what are you seeing?
Hey, Adele, good afternoon. Well, when we showed up here, this distribution started about an hour ago at 12 o'clock, and I talked to the first people in line saying they got here at 8:30 this morning to wait in line just to have some fresh food, some pantry staples so that they could have more food at home for their family. So behind me in the black tent, that is where these families are getting checked in. They are checking for federal government employee or contractor IDs. This food bank is specifically for federal workers. And I want to kind of take you, Del, through what these folks are getting to take home. They're starting over here. There's a variety of fresh vegetables that they can take. There's bok choy, there's some squash and zucchini, some kale, some cucumbers, all trying to make sure that we're not just taking pantry staples home, but they are taking fresh food home. Then there are these two boxes per person. The top little one, that's got spaghetti sauce, canned chicken and tuna, cereal, some fruit spreads, some milk, and then below, more fresh produce, some apples, some carrots, trying to make sure that these families are getting food that is good for them as well, some fresh, healthy produce. And then beyond that, that's where we've got some additional grocery store donations. But after these two boxes, everything else you see here has been donated by grocery stores, and it's up to the families what they decide they want to take home. If they want some of the fresh fruit, if they want some of the milk. There were a lot more an hour ago. There were more cookies and bagels and bread and tortilla chips, just kind of trying to offer families as much as they possibly can so that they can help make sure that there is food on the table for their spouses, for their children, for anyone they have at home. So this is the second week, Del, for this food bank specifically for federal workers. They're doing 5 different distribution sites around the D.C. metro area. And last week, they helped 1,500 federal workers provide food for their households. And they are going to be doing even more this week. Last week, this site where we are in Hyattsville, Maryland, it was the first distribution site for federal workers. They doubled the amount of food. They showed up with enough food for 150 households. They knew quickly by the length of the line that was not going to be enough. They brought in more. They brought in even more this week. All of the distribution sites are going to be stocked to help 400 households get some fresh food, get some pantry staples to try to help bridge the gap for all of these federal workers, whether they're furloughed, whether they're stuck at home and not getting a paycheck, or whether they're an essential worker and they were still having to go to work but still not getting a paycheck. The Capital Area Food Bank working with their regular partners to try to do as much as they can, and they are promising to continue these food distributions specifically for federal workers and contracts for the length of the government shutdown, no matter how long it goes, Del.
Yeah, it is good to see they're picking up the need, but it is a sad sign of our times. Scripps News Washington correspondent Stephanie Liebergen for us. Stephanie, as always, we thank you for your reporting.
We'll be right back to continue our look at today's top stories. You're watching Today As It Happens, Scripps News rundown of the biggest events and stories of the day. So let's jump right in.
This week we learned that more than 41 million people who receive SNAP benefits won't be getting their funds in just a matter of days. SNAP covers food costs for households that are at or below the poverty line. So we're joined now by Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins. She joins us now live from the White House. Madam Secretary, thanks for being with us. Right now, there is more than $5 billion in emergency funding available to your agency that could be used to cover the gaps in SNAP while the government is closed. But your agency is saying those funds will not be used. Can you explain that decision?
Well, here's the bottom line. We have been saying now for almost a month that as of November 1st, we will not have the $9.2 billion available that will be required for the entire month of November. And the way that the formulas and the math works, that is an unequivocal, sort of uncontested number. We don't have the funding that is needed to keep the SNAP program going through November. When you marry that to the fact that the Democrats have now for 12 straight times voted to keep the government closed, I find it particularly rich that now they're saying, and even some of the states are suing, oh, but wait, you have a little bit of money in this particular fund that is to be used for disaster relief. Why can't we pivot that money to pay for this? Well, it's $9.2 billion to make sure that the SNAP funding is covered for the month. 42 million people. And again, we are where we are. We have warned about this now for 28 straight days. It's time to open the government. The Republicans want nothing. They just want to keep the government moving. And I think that's what all Americans need to understand about this.
I understand what you're saying, but if you're hungry, and we've been seeing all of these stories coming out of food banks, a hungry person doesn't really care if they're a Republican or a Democrat. They just know that they're hungry. Is there $5 to $6 billion sitting in a fund right now that USDA could use that is set aside for disaster relief like Melissa, but Melissa is striking Jamaica? Is that money there or not?
Well, again, you're right. Hunger is not Republican or Democrat. It is not blue or red. We will open the government. That $9.2 billion for November will flow immediately. Even the left-leaning Democrat federal government employee union is saying open the government and do it now. There is a couple of $1 billion sitting in a contingency fund.
The money there?
There is money there, but again, it's a 9.2 number. You can't just piece and parcel it. It is a full amount that has to flow to the states, and this is very easy to fix. Just vote yes on a continuing resolution and not hold these 42 million hungry people subject to free illegal alien health care, gender mutilation, LGBTQI things in the Balkans. This is insanity, and the Democrats' march toward this craziness makes absolute no sense. So I will not stand here and allow anyone to say that, oh, this is the Republicans' fault because USDA has a couple of $1 billion sitting in a contingency fund for disaster relief, when this is a $9.2 billion question. You vote yes on a continuing resolution, the government opens, and these benefits will flow. That's the story here.
I understand that, but what I'm asking is, if I am sitting at home and I can't feed my family, I've heard stories of people saying they're worried about not being able to have a Thanksgiving meal in the land of plenty. All I'm asking, is there money that you could tap into right now without having to go through a CR, continuing resolution, or going through Congress? Is there money right now?
Okay, Dale, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. For the third time, let me explain. It takes $9.2 billion to fully fund the SNAP program for November. For 28 days, we have been saying November 1, we don't have enough money to fund the SNAP program. We are now a few days out from November 1, 28 days to be exact. It's a yes vote to fully fund the program that you are talking about. USDA has a couple of $2 billion, but the idea on how you send that out, we don't have the formulas to do that. Now, again, vote yes. Everyone's telling you to vote yes. This problem is solved overnight, and we're not even having to have this conversation.
So I understand what you're saying is that there is money, but there is $9.2 billion that is needed for the month of November. Not any piece of that, not any parcel of that. Is that correct?
That is correct. And then you look at the fact that no one's getting paid. Air traffic controllers, our law enforcement. I mean, it's just one thing after another. So I know I'm here to talk about SNAP, but let's think about the whole context of even what we're discussing right now. Talk about not being able to have Thanksgiving meals. What about the air traffic controller who has, you know, a family at home and that's the only income? They're not eligible for the SNAP benefits. They're trying to get food on the table too. This is so much bigger than this one program. And again, I hear you. No one wants to fund SNAP and feed hungry people more than I do. It is a program at USDA. But the idea that we're going to blame the Republicans or Donald Trump or our administration for this is
I don't think that was our
lunacy and
intention.
ludicrous.
We're just trying to find out whether or not there were funds available. It is not an RRD issue if you're hungry. I want to switch gears, though. I want to talk about soybean farmers.
Well, it is, though, if the
president is set
Democrats
to
are
meet
shutting
with-
the government down. It is an RRD issue. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I want to talk about the president's upcoming meeting with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. The Treasury Secretary saying soybean farmers are going to be happy. Can you give us a hint as to why they're going to be happy and whether or not Chinese markets are going to be open to our soybean exports?
Well, our Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, I think just a day or two ago, made an announcement that he has had extremely productive conversations with the Chinese, which is very helpful. We've got a lot of our soybean farmers who have had to put their soybeans, we're in harvest right now, into storage so that we can hopefully sell them at some point. Obviously, the farm economy has been struggling now for the last few years. No new trade deals in the last administration. The cost of inputs out of control, new interest rates 73%, fuel up, labor up 47%. And so all of this, we've met this sort of perfect storm. And then you've got China, who purchases about 65 or 70% of American soybeans, who obviously, because of the trade negotiations, had realized that they're not saying they're not going to buy anything. But in fact, if they had abided by the 2019 trade deal with China, we wouldn't even be here. I think the bigger question is, well, the quick question is yes, it looks like we're going to be able to move forward. That's what Secretary Bessent has said. President will be with the leader of China soon, and they'll continue those conversations on Thursday. But the longer term objective here is to ensure that our farmers are not put in this sort of position again. And that underscores why all of these different trade deals, opening up all of these markets and not relying on one, is so very, very important. But for now, today, good news for our soybean farmers, and we're grateful, hopefully when that deal gets inked, to be able to move some of those soybeans, those great American soybeans, out across the world.
So how much? How much?
I don't know the answer to that. I am here in Washington working, trying to keep things going as smoothly as possible while Secretary Bessent and others are out on the negotiating. And ultimately, I'm not sure anyone really knows exactly how much of anything until President Trump gets in the room. He really likes to be the final sort of say, the signature on the line. And you know, they may say X amount of soybeans and the president says, well, instead of X amount, why don't we do Y amount, which sometimes is, you know, double or triple X, and he'll get even a better deal than any of us thought was possible. So we'll see. He said for a long time that that Xi Jinping is a very good negotiator. He does a really good job representing his country. But the president, he's so good at this. He's sort of our deal maker in chief. And again, I feel very confident in where this is moving for our farmers and our ranchers.
Madam Secretary, final question before I let you go. I'm old enough to remember a commercial with Clara Peller for Wendy's in which she's an elderly woman and she says, "Where's the beef?" The beef right now is with America's cattlemen who are upset because we're learning that there may be 4 times more low tariff beef coming from Argentina than was first thought. U.S. cattlemen are not too happy about that. What can you tell us about beef imports coming in from Argentina, and will that actually take place?
Yeah, let's talk about that for just a quick second. So right now, Americans consume about 12 million metric tons of beef every single year. Of that 12 million metric tons, 2 million we import. This is not new. This is not a brand new announcement. We have long imported, especially the less expensive, like ground beef, et cetera. We have used and relied upon foreign imports to do that. Of course, we've got the lowest cattle herd in 75 years. We've got screwworm south of the border, so that has stopped a lot of the cattle movement in. The drought has been pretty significant over a few years. You've got a lot of reasons. Cost of inputs, as I mentioned, out of the roof under the last administration for that low cattle herd, causing the high prices. What the president is trying to solve is to effectuate his promise to American people to bring the cost of goods down. We're seeing it come down in almost every single category, but because of, as I mentioned, all of the challenges to our cattle ranchers, we've seen a much less herd than we have in the past. The president was talking about taking Argentina from about 20,000 metric tons of that total 12 million. So 20,000 from Argentina is about what we get right now, up to perhaps 40,000 or maybe 60,000. Certainly it's good to, to move more supply in, but what we're talking about and supporting our great American cattle ranchers, releasing our 19-point plan last week on building that herd back up, but making sure that the consumer is part of these conversations as well. That's what the president is working to solve. That's what he was talking about last week. I feel very bullish that those are not mutually exclusive goals, that we will be able to do both in the coming months.
We'll be right back with more of today's top stories on Today as It Happened. We're glad you're back with Today as It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer here with your daily rundown of today's top stories.
A federal judge has ordered a senior Border Patrol officer to meet with her every night to discuss the government's immigration crackdown in Chicago. District Court Judge Sarah Ellis making that extraordinary order following weeks of street confrontations and complaints of excessive force. Greg Bovino, who leads the Trump administration's immigration sweeps in big cities, must report to the judge each and every day at 6 p.m. The judge also setting a Friday deadline for Bovino to get a body camera and complete training. President Trump is in Japan at this hour, part of his three-nation tour through Asia. The president meeting with the newly elected Japanese prime minister for the first time. It is a woman. And then he signed a rare earth mineral agreement. His next stop is South Korea, where he is expected to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bull is live right now for us on the North Lawn. And Haley, tell us more about these new deals with Japan.
Well, President Trump is calling the U.S.'s relationship with Japan thriving as the countries are rolling out a slate of agreements. It includes specifically cooperation on technology like artificial intelligence, new investments, including the purchase of U.S. energy, Toyota exporting U.S.-made vehicles to Japan, and continuing implementing a framework reached over the summer, which the White House previously announced, including more than a $500 billion investment from Japan. Additionally, as Japan is increasing its defense capabilities, President Trump announcing the delivery of missiles for Japan's F-35s, while Japan's prime minister affirmed the country's commitment to the Indo-Pacific and building up their defense. Both leaders praising each other, specifically as both were close with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Listen.
And we had a phenomenal day here in Japan with a momentous trade deal. We made a big, beautiful trade deal for both countries. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, I think Japan also had their best stock market day ever. So your new prime minister is doing very well. First female, first woman prime minister. And I said, you already hit the highest stock price you've ever hit. But tonight I'm more confident than ever that the friendship between the United States and Japan is strong as it can be. And it's thriving, it's prosperous, and it'll soon be, I think, greater than ever before.
Now, Trump also met with families of Japanese citizens kidnapped by North Korea, as Trump on this trip overseas has indicated a willingness to meet with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, though nothing has been announced on that front. The president also speaking with troops while in Japan, in which he touted his administration's military policies, indicated that his administration would use federal resources to combat crime in more U.S. cities, and touted strikes against vessels the administration believes are trafficking narcotics, Del. And next, President Trump heads to South Korea, where, as you mentioned, he is expecting to meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Officials this week have indicated they are narrowing in on a potential trade deal between the United States and China, Del.
Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bull live on the North Lawn. Haley, as always, we thank you very much. Believe it or not, we are now 1 week away from Election Day again. All eyes on two major races for governor, one in Virginia, the other in New Jersey, and a shift in the polls in a hotly contested election in the Old Dominion. Right now, we're joined by Scripps News political director Andrew Rafferty. And Raff, first, those two governor's races. What are you watching right now? What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's interesting going into next week. Democrats are cautiously optimistic on both of these races. Two big states, of course, electorally relevant quite often. One not far from where we are here in Washington, D.C. That, of course, as you just mentioned, Virginia. But let's start with New Jersey. If you're outside of the Garden State, probably you haven't been paying too close of attention to this. But you can see the polling. This is an average of polls from Real Clear Politics. And Mikey Sherrill, a Democratic member of the House of Representatives, with about a 4-point lead over the Republican Jack Ciattarelli. So that's why Democrats are hopeful going into tomorrow. But there is some reason for some caution. And that is, number one, New Jersey, Del, has not elected a member of the same party to the governor 3 times in a row since 1961. And their current governor is a Democrat, Phil Murphy. So this would break that streak, electing another governor to Trenton to head the Garden State. It's also worth noting that a year ago, Kamala Harris won the state by just 6 points, which was also a much slimmer margin than has historically been the norm in New Jersey. It was back until 1992 when it was that close. And in the biggest issues in Jersey right now, it really is property taxes, taxes in general, the cost of living. Trump is certainly playing a bit of a role. Some of the advertising does revolve around Trump's relationship with Jack Ciattarelli, but it is a much smaller role than here or across the river in Virginia. Yeah, it looks
what
like
about the canceling of the tunnel going into Manhattan from New Jersey, which really affects a lot of people in New Jersey?
Yeah, especially northern Jersey. That has been playing in. I think, when you talk about federal funding and aid to the state, that has crept in. But most of what Mikey Sherrill's advertising is really focused on is being able to, both her background is not only being a House member, that's part of it, but much more so her time in the Navy, her sort of leadership, and her ability to stand up to Trump and to most specifically bring down taxes, utility bills, cost of living for those in New Jersey, which we know is one of the most heavily taxed states.
And I apologize for interrupting.
No, and we'll go to a state you know very well, Virginia. Because when we're talking about Trump and we're talking about some of the government funding projects, Virginia is probably a better example. And you see here, Abigail Spanberger with a little bit more of a comfortable lead over the lieutenant governor running to become governor, Winsome Earl Sears. Top of mind issues, democracy, inflation, healthcare. Trump playing a bigger role because of both those DOGE cuts. We know so many in Virginia are government workers, especially in northern Virginia. And after Elon Musk, some of the other rhetoric from the White House about sort of downsizing the federal workforce. But it's really interesting, and I know you know this well, the Attorney General's race is really impacting this race. There's a Democrat, Jay Jones. He's running against incumbent Jason Miyares. Jay Jones has these text messages, really indefensible text messages from a couple years ago talking about violence against Republicans in that state. He has apologized for it, but it is not it's not like he sent them when he was 18 years old. This was from a few years ago, and Republicans in that state who are just trying to make some inroads here, probably their last best chance at an upset, are trying to tie Abigail Spanberger and the other Democrats on the ticket to those text messages. We'll see how well.
But I know what you'll be doing a week from today.
That's right.
Our Scripps News political director, Andrew Rafferty. Raff, as always, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Did ICE go too far in those immigration raids that are sweeping the nation? Immigration authorities using tear gas and pepper spray when confronting protesters in major U.S. cities. And now a federal judge is cracking down. Scripps News reporter Patrick Terpstra has been following a hearing held today in Chicago, closely watched. Patrick, Chicago has become a flashpoint, a place where we have seen those intense clashes between immigration enforcement officers and protesters. Judge, it seems, wasn't having any of it.
Yeah, she really had a lot of strong words there in Chicago, and all of this happening, as you said, in a city that really has seen a lot of aggressive immigration enforcement action. The question today at this hearing is all of this going too far, especially when it comes to the use of tear gas and pepper spray against protesters who show up at a lot of these enforcement actions and arrests, including one last week. We got some video of where you can see one of the issues that this judge has been talking about. A lot of protesters, there are dozens of them out there, are seen as tear gas is deployed. Yeah, there you see the tear gas there. And while you do see so many people there, what you don't see, according to the protesters, is provocation. Nor do you see what the judge has said is very important, and that is to have warning given at least twice to bystanders before chemical irritants like that can do a lot of damage are actually used. Here's what one person on the ground said was playing out as those irritants were deployed.
There were probably 100 people out here when I got here. There's a lot of people working from home who had eyes on this. Many neighbors in the intersection. I spoke to several who had been tear gassed by ICE without warning and without interfering with what ICE was doing.
The judge had a lot of questions about this video. Also, in the hot seat testifying today was Greg Bavino. This is a top official with Customs and Border Patrol leading the enforcement efforts in Chicago. You can see him there throwing what appears to be a tear gas canister into a crowd there. The judge asking about that incident and a Halloween parade over the weekend where children were exposed to tear gas. She asked Bavino if that was appropriate, making very clear she didn't think it was. Also reminding him of his constitutional oath, telling him that he is to now wear a body camera as he patrols these areas and report to her every day about how things are going. One other thing that she told Bavino was to every day not only meet with her, but to provide reports of how often force is actually used. Bavino said that would take a lot of time to actually compile because there are so many incidents where force is used. But DHS, Homeland Security, has defended this, saying that they have dozens of assaults that have been made upon law enforcement officers working these immigration cases, and that these protesters can get out of control. They say they know how to use things like tear gas and pepper spray, and that they're not just meant to protect those officers working these raids, but they're also meant to protect the public. The hearing wrapped up without the judge making any sort of ruling from the bench about whether she might try to impose more restrictions. But Del, this is a case that's going to continue to play out.
At least every evening at 6 o'clock when Bavino has to go before the judge. Scripps News investigative correspondent Patrick Terpstra live for us. Patrick, as always, we thank you.
You're watching Today as It Happened. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Today as It Happened. I'm Holly Furfur. All right, let's jump right back into our rundown of the top stories of the day.
Hurricane Melissa still hammering Jamaica. That massive storm making landfall this afternoon. She came ashore as a Category 5 storm and remains a Category 5 storm now for 2 hours straight. Officials say there could be as much as 30 inches of rain dumped on the island nation, but they say storm surge is now their biggest concern. Meteorologist Shay Ryan from our Scripps News Group is tracking the storm. And Shay, how long is Melissa going to track across Jamaica?
Well, the center of the storm is getting very close to the northern coastline, and you can see right now that the very well-organized eye is no longer the case. So it has weakened some, but is still at 160-mile-per-hour maximum sustained winds, and the pressure is still at 906 millibars. So it made landfall about 2.5 hours ago, and you can see how the eye has come apart. It's not as well defined, but the center of the storm is about 10 to maybe 13 miles from Montego Bay, and then we'll be moving offshore, and well, it's probably got about another 10 miles before the center moves out over open water again. So at that point, it may start to weaken. And, typically as it moves over open water, it would be strengthening. But as it's approaching here into Cuba and making landfall again, the interaction that it has with land is going to, it appears at this point that it should start to weaken a little bit more, which will be good news for Cuba. But again, making landfall late tomorrow, or at some point tomorrow during the day, and moving across very slowly and then exiting Cuba on the north side by Wednesday morning. So it's still quite a duration of time here before it's back out into open water, moving across the Caribbean, finally getting out over open water and beyond the Caribbean and making its way towards Bermuda by late in the day on Wednesday. So you can see how these outer rain bands, very heavy rain and very wide and offset to the north of the center of the storm. And then again, here is Crooked Island, and it's going to be moving past that then by Thursday, and it will stay to the north and to the west of Bermuda. That's the little tiny dot that you might be able to see just there off on the corner. And that would be by Friday at 3 o'clock in the morning. So there's still a lot of time between now and when that storm really starts to pull away from impacting any land masses. But thanks to that frontal system that's moving across the state of Florida on Wednesday, that's going to help to push that system out into the Atlantic and allow it to pick up some forward motion, because it has been moving so slowly. And you can see how the winds, again, are pretty tightly packed around the center, or at least where the hurricane force winds are pretty tightly packed. But it's that storm surge when it's approaching that really causes a lot of the catastrophic damage as that storm moves forward. And then on the backside, with it being as strong as it is, it's still going to bring storm surge onto the north side of the island as well and continue. So this is quite a path of destruction that this storm is going to be leaving in its wake.
Shay, twofold question, which is one, when we talk about maximum sustained winds, those are sustained winds, but the wind gusts can be much, much higher. And also, what type of destruction are we likely?
I mean, we're talking catastrophic. So especially with a place like Jamaica, where the infrastructure would not be as great and as strong as it would be in some areas of the United States where we have higher building codes and standards, we are talking about leveling of buildings. And when it comes to the storm surge itself, the amount of flooding will be catastrophic. We're talking about a very serious situation here, not just for parts of Jamaica, but also going into Cuba, and some of our islands here can also, even though they're not getting a Cat 5 storm, we're still looking at some significant impacts moving across the Caribbean.
We'll be right back to continue our rundown of today's top stories on Today as It Happened. Welcome back to Today as It Happened, Scripps News debrief of our top stories of the day. So let's get to it.
The president tried his best to negotiate with the Democrat leaders. They effectively gave him the middle finger in the Oval Office. And so he said he did his best. He urged them not to close the government down because he knew the pain that would be inflicted on the people. And there's nothing more for him to do.
This is now day 28 of the government shutdown here in Washington, D.C. And SNAP, also known as food stamps, and WIC, the government program that helps mothers, infants, and children, will run out of money on Saturday. In Washington, the blame game continues, each side blaming each other. But on Main Street, hunger knows no political affiliation. Here is the looming crisis by the numbers. We're talking 42 million people who rely on SNAP. There are real people with real mouths to feed. This is a common refrain.
Please rethink this situation that you're doing. You all don't need to go hungry. You don't need to be without electricity. You don't need to be without gas. You can't do this to the people. I'm trying to stay alive. And you're hurting the people of the United States. But you'll go across country and stop wars. And I realize that's important, but so is the United States. Please rethink your decisions.
We begin with our congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed at the nation's capital, where politicians are starting to feel the heat. Nate, what are you finding?
Well, Del, look, the situation remains largely the same up here. The 13th attempt to reopen the federal government, fund all of those programs, including SNAP and WIC, just failed on the Senate floor earlier this afternoon. There's no indication that any votes later this week could go any differently, even with this increased pressure. And look, it's not just SNAP and WIC. Now, one of the largest groups of federal government employees is calling on Democrats, or at least apparently calling on Democrats, to move toward the Republican position and fund the government at current funding levels, dealing with the issue of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which expire at the end of this year, at a later time. And look, Democrats have maintained that is what this fight is all about. They're trying to keep those Affordable Care Act subsidies from expiring, prevent Americans from facing far higher health care costs when they go for open enrollment during the month of November in various states on their health care exchanges or marketplaces. But at this point, both sides are exceptionally dug in, and Democrats and Republicans not seeing eye to eye. Republicans now touting the union's position, something which is fairly uncommon up here on Capitol Hill. Unions typically have supported Democrats politically in the past. Take a listen.
It's not very often that I get a chance to say this, but I agree with the AFGE, American Federation of Government Employees, who largest government employees union, who said earlier this week that the Democrats need to reopen the government and start getting federal employees paid again.
We need to do both. Both have federal workers get paid in every way and negotiate a way to resolve the Americans' pain in the health care crisis.
Republicans have accused Democrats of being beholden to the progressive wing of their party, listening to party activists rather than the many government employees, families who receive SNAP and WIC funding during this shutdown battle. Again, Democrats say they want to keep up this fight for these Affordable Care Act subsidies. But again, Del, 13 votes on government funding have failed already in the last 28 days. At this point, it does not seem like either side is willing to back down. President Trump is out of the country, making it just all the more difficult to sit down and negotiate with Democrats, which is precisely what they're asking for. Republicans have maintained they'll conduct a negotiation with Democrats, but only once the Democrats vote with Republicans to reopen the government.
Our congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed for us live on Capitol Hill.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. We hope you have a great Tuesday night.